The winter of 1944 pressed itself against the Pacific front, like a cold, wet hand, heavy with salt and quiet dread. Dawn broke without warmth. Only a pale smear of light caught in drifting mist that crawled low over the muddy ground. The air tasted of rusted metal, rotting palm trunks, and gunpowder that had soaked in the soil over months of stalled fighting. Nothing moved freely here. Even the wind seemed careful, weaving itself around shattered coconut trees and half-collapsed edges of shallow trenches, where exhausted men waited for the next impossible order. Elias Moreira crouched in one of those trenches, boots sinking into mud that clung like hands trying to hold him in place. His uniform, faded and stiff with salt, fit him poorly, as if it still belonged to some other soldier who had vanished in the jungle's wet mouth. He wiped mist from his eyelashes and scanned the ruined landscape with the same patient attention he once used on furrows of earth back home. There, he had worked alone, guiding a mule through fields that demanded long days, silence, and a willingness to see patterns hidden in dust and weeds. Here, he felt a strange familiarity in the chaos. The way shadows gathered behind tree stumps, how vines curve around the same branches every morning, how footprints harden differently depending on the hour and the last rainfall. It was not the same world, but he understood parts of it well enough. Most of the officers barely noticed him. He spoke little, preferred manual tasks, and never pushed himself into the cluster of louder soldiers who debated rumors or complained about the food. To them, Elias was a quiet farmhand pushed into a war too large for him to matter. But he heard things. He watched even more, and he carried, deep behind his ribs, the one memory he refused to think about for too long. His younger brother standing in their doorway the day Elias left, holding a sack of dried beans and trying not to show how much he feared running the farm alone. Elias had promised he would return before the next harvest. He wasn't sure he believed his own words, but he said them anyway, because someone had to. Now, as the mist thickened and the morning stretched slow and tense, Elias felt a familiar tightening in the air that meant trouble was coming. A single shot cracked from the tree line. It echoed in the sodden quiet like a hammer strike, sharp and precise. Someone yelled and dropped behind a mound of sandbags. Another shot followed, then another, each spaced with almost machine-like discipline. There was no chaos in these bullets. They were measured, patient, and absolutely lethal. Snipers, well hidden, well trained. The trench shuddered with movement as soldiers pressed themselves into the ground, muttering prayers or curses. A medic tried to crawl toward a man whose leg bled through soaked bandages, but he barely managed 2 meters before the next bullet punched the dirt inches from his face. He froze, paralyzed by the knowledge that it had already been seen. Elias watched it all with a kind of grim clarity. The snipers did not shoot wildly. They waited for motion, for any hint of someone rising or reaching or shifting too far from cover. They were close enough to choke the entire position, far enough to stay invisible behind moss-covered roots and tangled undergrowth. Every message runner who attempted to reach the command post was taken down before he made it halfway. Supplies that should have come through hours earlier were now pinned behind a ridge no one could cross. The company wasn't just trapped. It was being starved of every solution. The lieutenant shouted orders, but his voice trembled with frustration. He demanded scouts. No one moved. He called for suppression fire. No one could see where to aim. He finally sent a bolder messenger sprinting across the open patch of mud, waving his arms and shouting something about medical tents. The sniper fired once. The messenger folded as if struck by an invisible hammer and slid face first into the mud. No scream, just the sickening thud of a body hitting the ground. A hush settled over the trench, the kind that made men realize they were prey. Elias's heartbeat slowed into that steady, grounded rhythm he recognized from years of wrestling with stubborn farm problems. Broken wagon wheels, sudden storms, livestock panicking in the night. Situations where no one expected a miracle, but someone still had to think clearly. He stared at the ridgeline where the snipers hid. The mist clung to the trees in a way that distorted shapes, turning branches into silhouettes and vines into long, motionless arms. He noticed something the others missed, a strange predictability in the enemy's shooting. The rhythm wasn't random. It wasn't even strategic in the traditional sense. It was obsessive, the way someone might keep tapping a point on a map to confirm it was real. They were anxious to validate every target. They shot faster when they believed they saw movement, slower when unsure. Their discipline cracked just a little under uncertainty. That thought clicked into place like a seed dropping into fertile soil. Back home, when crows learned to recognize his real silhouette in the fields, Elias had built decoys from whatever he found. Gourd shells, sticks, scraps of cloth. He placed them where light and wind created just enough illusion to confuse the birds. It didn't take perfection, only suggestion. A shape, a glimmer, a shadow. He breathed, slow and deep, and the idea anchored itself firmly in his mind. Across the trench, soldiers whispered fears, cursed the snipers, wonder if they'd see the next sunrise. The lieutenant knelt with his head in his hands, muttering that they were running out of options. Elias pressed his hand into the mud, feeling its cold grit squeeze between his fingers. He studied the debris scattered around him. A cracked helmet, a battered canteen, a torn strip of fabric hanging from a broken rifle strap. It was enough, but he didn't speak yet. He let the thought grow, shape itself, clarify into a plan so fragile it might break if described too soon. For the first time that day, Elias lifted his eyes not with fear, but with resolve. The snipers were controlling everything, movement, supplies, morale, but they had one weakness. They reacted to ghosts just as much as they did to men, and Elias knew how to make ghosts. The lieutenant barely looked up when Elias approached him. The man's face was gray with exhaustion, streaked with grime and disbelief. He had lost 3 messengers in less than an hour, and the weight of that failure bent his shoulders like an invisible yoke. Around them, the trench murmured with low, fearful voices, men pinned down by a threat they couldn't see, only hear, always one breath too late. Elias crouched beside him, speaking in the same quiet, steady tone he used when calming a frightened mule. "Sir, I can try something." The lieutenant blinked, as if the voice came from a place he didn't expect. He studied Elias for a long second, searching for signs of panic or delirium. He found none, only a strange calm in the farmhand's eyes, the calm of someone who had already survived many kinds of storms. "What exactly do you think you can try?" The officer asked, his voice hoarse. Elias didn't answer with words yet. Instead, he picked up the cracked helmet lying near his boots. He brushed away the mud, feeling its weight. It had a long, jagged fracture along one side where a bullet had once ricocheted. He rotated it until the split formed a shape that, from a certain angle, looked eerily like a shoulder under torn cloth. The lieutenant frowned. "What are you doing?" "I just need some scrap, something to catch the light. Cloth, maybe metal. Nothing important." A sergeant nearby scoffed. "We don't have time for ornaments, Moreira. We need a miracle." Elias looked at him, steady and unbothered. "I know. That's why I'm working." He began gathering debris with a quiet purpose that made several soldiers fall silent. They watched him pick up a dented canteen, a length of torn canvas, and a bent cooking pan whose metal still glimmered faintly beneath grime. It didn't look like much. In fact, it looked like nothing at all. But when Elias knelt in the mud and began assembling the pieces, something about his movements shifted. He placed each object with a craftsman's touch, aligning angles, gauging distances, turning scraps into shapes that hinted at a human outline when seen from treeline. One soldier whispered, "He's making something." Another murmured, "A dummy? That won't fool anyone." But Elias wasn't listening. He examined the mist, the broken palm trunks, the direction of the rising light. He noted how reflections behaved on wet surfaces, how shadows lengthened behind a half-buried stump, how the jungle swallowed motion but exaggerated stillness. He wasn't building a decoy. Not exactly. He was building a suggestion, a whisper form designed to mislead the eyes of men so tightly wound in vigilance that even a flicker could set off a shot. He dipped his fingers in the puddle beside him, thick with mud and scraps of vegetation, and smeared a thin coat along the metal pan. When wet, it created a faint, uneven shine resembling the glint of a rifle barrel catching light. He held it up, testing it, then nodded softly to himself. "This goes on the left," he murmured, "where the tree stump hides half the line." The sergeant stepped closer. "Moreira, You're not actually planning to leave the trench, are you? Elias looked at the ridge, at the fog still clinging to the vegetation like damp wool. Yes, it has to be placed where they will see it. Not here. A wave of disbelief rippled through the men. Even the lieutenant seemed taken aback by the simplicity of Elias's certainty. You understand they'll fire the second you move, the officer warned. Yes, Elias said, but they don't fire until they're sure. That's the part we can use. The lieutenant stared at him, caught between desperation and the faint, unexpected hope that comes when a man realizes he has no choices left. If you're wrong, he said quietly, you won't make it 10 meters. Elias folded the decoy components carefully, tying them with a strip of canvas to keep them from clattering. If I stay here, sir, the unit won't make it another hour. No one spoke after that. The truth was too sharp, too heavy to argue with. The moment Elias climbed in the trench, the world shrank into a narrow corridor of breath and heartbeat. The mud sucked at his boots with every step as he crawled low, almost part of the earth itself. His palms pressed into wet soil, cold enough to numb his skin. The mist thickened around him, cloaking him in a faint, shifting veil. He moved slowly, mindful of every leaf that might tremble, every branch that might snap. One wrong sound, and the snipers would react with lethal instinct. 3 meters, 5 meters, 7. A bullet cracked through a palm frond just above his head. Elias froze, breath held tight in his chest. He listened, not for movement, but for rhythm. Another shot came, but farther left this time, aimed at a place where no one actually was. A misread, a false cue. His heart hammered, but the pattern told him what he needed. They hadn't seen him. They were reacting to possibilities, not realities. He reached a fallen trunk, half burned and still smelling of old fire. Behind it, a wedge of shadow stretched toward the narrow path the snipers watched. It was a perfect spot, visible enough to provoke them, hidden enough to protect him while he worked. With calm hands, Elias planted the crude decoy. He angled the helmet just so, twisted the canvas to mimic the shape of a torso leaning, positioned the mud-polished metal shard where light could catch it just right. It was rough, uneven, barely human, but its imperfection was exactly what made it believable. It lived in the suggestion, not the detail. He whispered to himself, as if speaking to his brother miles away, just a little more, just hold on. Then he slid back behind the trunk, pressed himself into the mud, and reached for the strip of canvas tied to the decoy, his only means of giving it life. He waited, and the jungle waited with him, breathless and taut. The jungle held its breath around Elias, the mist curling like pale smoke around the fallen trunk that sheltered him. He lay almost flat, cheek pressed into cold mud, fingers wrapped around the strip of canvas that connected him to the decoy just a few meters away. Every muscle in his body was coiled, tense but steady, the way he used to crouch behind brush piles waiting for a wild dog that stalked the hens back home. He knew this kind of stillness, the kind that didn't break, only tightened. His mind drifted for half a second to his brother. The boy had always been impatient, always eager to act before thinking. Elias used to tell him that the land rewarded patience, that the world didn't bend for men who rushed. Now, lying here in the choking heat of a war he never asked for, Elias realized the jungle followed the same rule. Move too soon and you died. Move at the right moment, and maybe, just maybe, you lived. A faint breeze shifted, carrying the smell of damp bark and burnt cordite. It also carried something else, the soft metallic whisper of a bolt sliding into place somewhere on the ridge. The snipers were adjusting positions, searching for their next target. Elias felt their intent before he heard their next breath of sound. They were restless. Their shooting rhythm earlier had been strained, uncertain, irritated by the lack of visible movement. Good, he thought. Let them feel blind. He counted silently in his head, not numbers, but heartbeats. When he sensed the snipers leaning into their scopes, he tugged the strip of canvas ever so slightly. The decoy shifted. Not much, just a soft sway, the kind caused by someone easing up from a crouch to check the trail. The mist blurred the details, turning the silhouette into a suggestion rather than a shape. It was enough. A rifle crack from the ridge. The bullet tore through the canvas and slammed into the mud behind it. Elias didn't flinch. Instead, he let the decoys settle again, like a man dropping back behind cover after a near hit. Another shot followed, then another, faster now. The snipers were firing reflexively, trying to pin down what they believed was a soldier too cautious to show himself fully. Elias waited. He did nothing for several seconds. The silence stretched thin and long. The snipers hesitated, uncertain. And when they hesitated, they leaned forward, always forward, hungry to confirm, to see, to verify. That was when he twitched the canvas again. The decoy tilted in a stuttering motion, as if shifting weight, to peek left. The response was immediate. A sharp, frustrated volley hit the decoy's general area from 2 different angles. One shot clipped the cracked helmet, spinning it slightly. Another kicked up a spray of wet soil. The snipers had taken the bait more aggressively than before. Hidden behind his trunk, Elias closed his eyes and listened. He didn't need to see them. Their rhythm told him everything. Their breathing, carried faintly by the wind, their impatience, their cadence, their dwindling confidence. The snipers were tightening their pattern, firing more rapidly than before. That meant stress. Stress meant mistakes. Mistakes meant survival. For the first time since the attack began, Elias felt a faint stir of control returning to the trapped unit. Behind him, far back in the trench line, soldiers lifted their heads cautiously, unable to see Elias's position, but aware that something had changed. The sniper fire was no longer precise. It was angry, reactive, scattered. One man muttered, "What's happening?" Another whispered, "They're wasting ammo." The lieutenant rose just enough to peer over a sandbag, eyes narrowing at the ridge. He couldn't see the decoy clearly through the mist, but he could see the pattern. The incoming shots lacked the disciplined intervals that had pinned them for hours. He breathed out, hope flickering in his chest like a small flame. But Elias wasn't done. He needed to push them further, just to the edge where instinct overrode training. He tugged the strip again, harder this time. The decoy jerked upright in a clumsy imitation of someone trying to rise too quickly. The response was explosive. 5 shots rang out almost simultaneously. They were wild, desperate. One snapped through the decoy's shoulder, tearing the canvas open. Another shattered the mud-coated metal piece, sending shards spraying like sparks. A third ripped through the wooden stake holding the structure upright, splitting it and causing the entire decoy to collapse sideways. It fell with a soft, wet thud. Elias didn't move. He listened. The snipers did not stop shooting. They kept firing into the fallen decoy, convinced they had struck a real body. Their rhythm accelerated into frenzy, each shot more urgent than the last, each bolt cycle louder, sharper. And then, like a badly tuned engine sputtering to a halt, the rifle fire slowed. One shot, then a long pause. Another, a click without a bullet, unmistakable. Elias opened his eyes. "They're reloading," he whispered to the mud beneath his face. Finally, he pulled himself backward, inch by inch, careful not to disturb the branches shielding him. When he reached a dip in the ground, he slid into it and exhaled shakily. Sweat stung his eyes despite the cold. Behind him, the trench stirred with motion. The lieutenant, recognizing the sudden lull, barked quick, sharp orders. Scouts, 2 groups, flank left and right. Move now while they're blinded. Men rose from the mud like figures unearthing themselves from graves. Their fear had not vanished, but it had shifted, no longer paralyzed, now propelled by opportunity. They sprinted and broke in zigzags, weaving through palm stumps, using smoke and debris for cover. For the first time all day, the snipers didn't shoot. They were too busy clawing for ammunition, too busy questioning what had just happened. Elias could feel their confusion from meters away. He crawled through the wet underbrush, slower now, returning toward the trench as carefully as he had left it. Each meter felt longer than the last. His arms trembled with exertion. Mud clung to his uniform in thick patches. His breath was shallow but controlled. When he finally reached the edge of the trench, 2 soldiers grabbed his arms and pulled him in before he lost balance. They stared at him, eyes wide, as if unsure he was real. Elias blinked at them, trying to steady his breathing. "It worked," he murmured. The sergeant who had mocked him earlier shook his head with something like disbelief or respect. "You mad farmer. You actually did it." But the jungle had not spoken its last word. From the ridge came angry shouting in a foreign tongue, frantic, disordered. Branches cracked. Boots pounded the earth. The snipers were moving, abandoning their nest before the flanking scouts reached them. The line was shifting. The battle was waking. And Elias, still covered in mud and trembling from adrenaline, understood that the decoy had only been the beginning. There was still more to come, and the jungle had many ways to demand a price. The forest erupted in movement the moment the snipers abandoned their perches. What had been a static, suffocating stalemate all morning now exploded into action as shouts ricocheted to the trees and boots hammered the ground in frantic retreat. The mist, once a curtain, now swirled as if thrown by the chaos, twisting around trunks and vines with each violent motion. It was no longer a quiet battlefield. It was alive, unsettled, shifting. Elias steadied himself against the trench wall, still breathing hard. His arms shook with delayed shock, but his gaze stayed fixed on the ridge where the snipers had hidden for so long. Now the carefully crafted illusion had broken, and the enemy, stripped of certainty and ammunition, was scrambling for advantage. They weren't retreating blindly. They were repositioning, trying to anchor a new line before the scouts closed in. The lieutenant, energized by the sudden break in the enemy's pattern, snapped out fresh orders. Push to the tree line. Secure the flank before they regroup. Move. A handful of soldiers vaulted out of the trench, rushing across the mud that had been suicidal moments earlier. Others followed, more cautiously but with rising confidence. The battlefield's rhythm had shifted, not entirely, but just enough to allow breath where none had existed. Elias watched them go, then looked down at his mud-streaked hands. They felt alien, yet familiar. These were the hands that once repaired wheel axles, dug irrigation channels, coaxed reluctant seeds into sprouting. Hands meant for creation, not destruction. Yet here he was, shaping the battlefield in ways no one had expected. The lieutenant turned to him. "Moreira, you're with the 2nd Advance Team. You know the ground better than anyone at this point." Elias hesitated. He wasn't a scout. He wasn't trained for this. But the lieutenant held his gaze, and behind that stern expression Elias saw something he had not seen before. Trust. He nodded once. The 2nd team moved out fast, weaving between broken palm trunks and the debris left from earlier bombardments. Elias followed close behind, scanning the undergrowth with the same intuitive sense he used to navigate overgrown fields after heavy rains. He felt tension humming in the air, an invisible thread connecting every trembling leaf and shifting shadow. As they neared the tree line, a sharp burst of gunfire cracked ahead. Not sniper fire this time, but short, frantic bursts from rifles. The scouts had caught up with the enemy's retreating figures. The engagement was scattered, unpredictable, dangerous. The 2nd team dove for cover behind a fallen log. Elias pressed his shoulder against the mossy bark and peered through a gap. He saw flashes of movement deeper in the jungle. The enemy scrambling to form a defensive arc, trying to buy time. They knew they had been outmaneuvered, but desperation made them reckless. One of the soldiers beside Elias muttered through clenched teeth, "They're setting up again. If they dig in, we'll lose the advantage." The lieutenant surveyed the scene from behind a cluster of ferns. "If they get stable firing positions, we're back in the same trap. We need to break them before they anchor." The problem was clear. The enemy was cornered, but cornered enemies didn't surrender. They fought harder. Elias felt the old instinct stirring again. Not soldiering, not aggression, just problem-solving. Tactical creativity shaped by dirt roads and irrigation ditches rather than manuals or rank. He studied the ground, the slope, the dampness of the soil, the way the jungle dipped into a natural hollow to the right. Rain had pooled there earlier, collecting behind a loose pile of debris from an old blast. A swollen mound of earth and broken branches sagged precariously over a narrow channel. An idea sparked. "Sir," Elias whispered, eyes fixed on the unstable mound. "The ground there is soft from the morning rain. If someone hits that pile, the whole thing will collapse and flood the low patch. The lieutenant frowned. Flood it? Yes. With enough force, the mud will slide. They're setting up in that hollow. It'll break their formation, maybe even force them into the open. A corporal beside them shook his head. That's a long shot. Might not budge an inch. Elias met his doubt calmly. It will. I've seen this before. Back home, same kind of slope, same kind of weight on soft soil. The lieutenant weighed the idea, then gave a sharp nod. If it works, it'll scatter them. Do it. The team shifted positions. Elias crawled toward a low vantage point where he could see the mound clearly. He signaled to two riflemen. Aim for the center. Not the top, the middle, where the mud is darker. The men adjusted their rifles, breath steadying. Elias counted down quietly. 3, 2, 1. The rifles barked. The first shot struck the mound. Mud trembled but held. Elias didn't panic. Again, same spot. 2 more shots hammered the weakened center. This time the earth groaned, a deep, wet cracking sound that echoed across the trees. The mound shuddered, shifted, and then collapsed with a heavy roar. A cascade of mud, water, branches, and debris poured down the slope like a miniature landslide, crashing into the hollow where the enemy had taken cover. Shouts erupted from the hollow. Men stumbled, slipping in the sudden flood of sludge that swallowed their footing. One of their guns misfired wildly into the air. Another fighter tried to climb out, only to slide back down the slick slope. The opening was instantaneous. Now, the lieutenant roared. The second team surged forward, rifles raised, pushing into the disoriented enemy. Gunfire echoed through the trees, sharp and chaotic. Soldiers moved like shadows between trunk and vine, using the enemy's panic to drive them further from their defensive positions. Elias stayed low but moved with the team, watching every shift in the terrain, every enemy shape breaking from cover. His lungs burned, his legs heavy, but he kept going, kept scanning. The mudslide hadn't ended the threat. It had only fractured it. In the middle of the chaos, one of the retreating snipers turned suddenly, rifle raised, eyes locking on the lieutenant. The officer didn't see him. Elias did, without shouting, without thinking. He lunged forward, pulling the lieutenant down just as the sniper fired. The bullet cracked past where the officer's head had been a heartbeat before. The lieutenant fell beside him, breath punched out. Elias rolled, grabbing the rifle from his shoulder, and fired once, a clean, controlled shot born not of aggression but necessity. The sniper dropped. The forest stilled for a single breath. Then the remaining enemy fighters finally broke, fleeing deeper into jungle with scattered shouts. The lieutenant stared at Elias, chest heaving. You saw him before I did. Elias swallowed hard, adrenaline still rushing through him. The angle was wrong. He stood out. The officer gave a short, stunned laugh, the kind men make when they recognize they've been saved by someone they least expected. Remind me never to underestimate a man who can read the land better than maps. The fight had turned. The snipers were gone. The line was opening. But the cost, the exhaustion, the truth of what had happened, all of that would come later. For now, the jungle held a rare silence, broken only by distant retreating steps fading into the vines. And Elias Moreira, farmhand turned improbable tactician, stood in that silence knowing the battle had not ended, only shifted shape once again. The jungle exhaled slowly after the skirmish, as if releasing the breath it had held since dawn. The mist, disturbed by gunfire and movement, drifted back into a soft, pale veil, settling between the palm trunks and hanging vines like a tired curtain returning to place after a violent scene. The air was still heavy, but no longer hostile. It felt watchful now, contemplative, as if waiting to see what the men would do with the silence they had earned. The ridge, once an invisible throne for the snipers, now lay abandoned. Mudslides scarred its lower flank. Broken nests of camouflage lay scattered where the enemy had fled in haste. Spent cartridges glittered faintly on the ground, catching stray hints of light as the sky began to clear. The battlefield that felt suffocating only hours earlier now breathed open, wide and strangely calm, like a wound at last relieved of pressure. Elias stood near the edge of the hollow, hands resting on his knees as he caught his breath. His uniform was soaked with sweat and rain, streaked with mud from neck to boots, heavy enough to feel like a second skin. His face was pale beneath layers of grime, but his eyes, tired, yes, but steady, scanned the forest with the same quiet alertness that had carried him through the day. Around him, soldiers moved carefully through the aftermath. Some secured the area, rifles pointed at shadows that might still hide danger. Others checked on wounded men, gently lifting bodies from the mud and carrying them toward the returning medics. The tension in their movements was different now. Not the desperation of prey, but the cautious relief of survivors. The lieutenant approached, limping slightly from a cut on his thigh, though he tried not to show it. His uniform was torn at the shoulder where Elias had pulled him down. He stopped a meter from the farmhand and studied him for a long moment. "You saved more than a line today," the officer said quietly. "You saved a man holding it." Elias shook his head, gaze still drifting across the forest floor. "They saved themselves, too. Everyone moved when they had to." "That's not what I meant," the lieutenant replied. His voice softened. "You broke their sight. You broke their rhythm. None of us could have done that. We're trained to look for soldiers. You saw the land, and you made the jungle lie for us." Elias didn't know what to say to that. Praise sat strangely on him, like a borrowed coat that didn't quite fit. He nodded once, grateful but uncomfortable, and looked down at his hands. They were trembling faintly, the adrenaline wearing off. A nearby soldier, the sergeant who had doubted him earlier, approached and offered him a canteen. "Here, you look like you could use this." His voice held no mockery now, only respect. Elias accepted the water, took a slow sip, then handed it back. "Thanks." The sergeant hesitated, then added awkwardly, "That thing you built, the decoy, I've never seen anything like it. Hell, I wouldn't have trusted a stack of scrap to save a mouse, and you used it to break a sniper line." Elias offered a small, tired smile. "It doesn't have to be perfect, just believable. Most things are fooled by what they expect to see." The sergeant nodded slowly, as if turning that truth over in his mind. "Come on," the lieutenant said, gesturing toward the ridge. "We need to check the positions they abandoned. Make sure they didn't leave anything nasty behind." Elias followed, stepping carefully over roots and fallen branches. As they climbed the slope, he noticed details others would have missed. The indentations where snipers had leaned their elbows, the branches trimmed to make narrow sightlines, the small piles of snapped twigs marking where they'd shifted stances. He traced these signs with his eyes, mapping their habits, imagining their frustration as the decoy bent and swayed under their relentless sight. At the top of the ridge, the view widened. The sea glittered far beyond the tree-line, waves crashing softly against the distant shore. The horizon was smudged with late afternoon gold, the first real warmth breaking through the day's pale gloom. In the middle of the ridge, half buried in churned mud, lay the shattered remains of the decoy. The cracked helmet, now dented almost flat. The torn canvas, soaked and sagging like skin peeled from bone. The splintered wood stake. The mud-coated metal shard that caught the sniper's eyes, now split in two like a broken mirror. It looked pitiful now, small, almost meaningless. Yet Elias felt something tighten in his chest when he saw it. The lieutenant stood behind him, silent. He understood. Elias knelt in front of the decoy, studying it as if it were a fallen animal. His fingers brushed a corner of the cloth, rough, cold, stiff with dried mud. He remembered shaping it, testing angles, trusting instincts no one else valued. This pile of ruin had been a lifeline, a thin string stretched between death and survival, and it had worked not because it was clever, but because Elias knew how to watch the world, how to listen to it, how to make it speak back. He swallowed hard, throat tight. For a moment, he wasn't in the jungle. He was home again, field behind him, his younger brother ahead of him, walking the roads with a too big hat and bare feet stained with dust. The boy had trusted him, believed in his calm explanations of how the earth behaved. "I'll be back before the next harvest," Elias had promised. As he stared at the broken decoy, he realized he still intended to keep that promise. A soft glow began to shimmer around the ridge, fireflies drifting lazily through the growing dusk. They blinked over the decoy, tiny pulses of gold like slow, thoughtful heartbeats. The broken scraps looked almost ceremonial under that light, as if the jungle itself were acknowledging the strange, quiet brilliance of the moment. The lieutenant placed a hand on Elias's shoulder. We'll rebuild the line. Push forward tomorrow. But what you did today, it'll be remembered, even if no one writes it down. Elias exhaled softly, watching a firefly land briefly on the cracked helmet. Doesn't need to be remembered, sir. Just needed to work. Maybe, the lieutenant said. But some things deserve to be remembered anyway. Elias didn't argue. He simply rose, brushing mud from his knees, and gave the decoy one last long look. Not out of pride, but gratitude. It had been nothing. It had become everything. And it had carried the weight no one else could bear. As he walked back down the ridge toward the regrouping men, the fireflies continued their quiet vigil over the broken silhouette in the mud. A small, silent monument to the truth the war rarely admitted. Sometimes victory came not from strength or rank or training, but from the humble eyes of a man who understood the land, and the courage of someone nobody ever saw coming.